Korea was a vassal state of China during the Qing Dynasty, the last imperial dynasty of China, while Korea was known as the Joseon Dynasty. In the mid-19th century, the Qing Empire was facing instability and losing territory to Western powers. In 1894, China went to war against Japan, the First Sino-Japanese War. The war was largely about control over Korea, which was seen as strategically important to both powers. Following the Japanese victory, China sued for peace, and in 1895 signed the Treaty of Shimonoseki. The war demonstrated the failure of the Qing dynasty. Korea won independence from China. The Joseon dynasty was replaced by the Korean Empire in the 1897. Korea had moved away from China and was now moving towards closer ties with Russia. They hoped that Russia would help secure their independence from the Japanese Empire. Japan was planning to invade Korea to gain more influence in East Asia. So the two empires, Russia and Japan, went to war in 1904, the Russo-Japanese War. Japan's ambition was to invade Korea and Manchuria, which Japan won. As a result, Korea was forced to become a protector of Japan in 1905, and in 1910, the Korea officially became a colony of the Empire of Japan. Japanese troops terrorized the Korean population by forcing men into slave labor and women into sexual slavery. The use of forced labor increased, and Japan underwent a massive military buildup. In the 1920s, many Korean fighters fled to Manchuria, which was ruled by the Chinese Communist Party, where they fought the Japanese army in guerrilla warfare. And one of these communist guerrilla leaders was Kim Song-ju, controlling a few hundred men in a group, and later Kim took the name Kim Il-sung, meaning Kim become the sun. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, and at the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, which marked the beginning of World War II, Japan gained control of large parts of China and much of East Asia. Kim and a dozen of his fighters escaped to Russia and joined the Soviet Union. On the August 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered to the Allies and ending the war. The Red Army moved through Manchuria, entered Korea, and captured Pyongyang on August 24, 1945. Russian and Americans each side wanted to control Korea for its strategic position in East Asia. Using a National Geographic map, and decided the 38th parallel line would be a good way to divide Korea, so that each side would have approximately half the Korean territory. In the years that followed, the Soviet and Americans met several times to discuss how Korea would be unified and to choose a leader. However, proposals from both sides were rejected, and each side followed a different path. In the South, the United States, with the support of the United Nations, called for elections to establish a democratic government, and in 1948, Syngman Rhee became president of the Republic of Korea. And in the North, Kim Il-sung was chosen by the Soviet and become Democratic People's Republic of Korea. In 1949, China also joined the Communist Party, so now North Korea is surrounded with two powerful communist countries. Both China and the Soviet Union encouraged North to unify the Korean peninsula under a communist regime, in an attempt at peace and unification. Kim sent 3 diplomats to the south, but Syngman Rhee rejected their offer. North Korea asked for help from its allies to invade South Korea. Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, gives his permission and equipment, but makes it clear that the Soviet Union will not intervene directly. Stalin was hoping to gain from a war in Korea was to distract America's attention away from Eastern Europe during Cold War. In the June 25, 1950, the Korean War began. The North Korean army crossed the 38th parallel line, pushed into the Seoul, the capital of South, and took the city. The The North Korean army was well disciplined, well trained, and well equipped. In the first 5 days, the South Army, which had 95,000 troops, was down to less than 22,000. And months later, the North had occupied most of the South all the way to the port at Busan. The US President, Harry Truman, said, "If we let Korea down, the Soviets will keep right on going and swallow up one place after another." In response to the invasion, the US-led UN forces intervened in support of South Korea. The United Nations Command agreed to assist South Korea and authorized the US government to appoint a commander. Douglas MacArthur was chosen by the US to be the UN commander. The US quickly sends forces with troops flown in from Japan toward the Busan port and battleships to Incheon.
With the enemy's supply line cut, the 8th Army would be able to break out of the Busan beachhead and launch a simultaneous attack from the southeast. By this time, the ships of Task Force 77, a United Nations armada, had left Japan with its cargo of 10th Corps troops and was nearing the west coast of Korea.
The United Nations, along with the US troops, they launched attacks on both fronts, capturing Incheon and the capital Seoul City, while simultaneously pushing the North Korean army back at Busan. The North Army started a mass retreat to the 38th parallel line. On the 29th of September, UN restored Syngman Rhee to the government. Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong warned the United States that China would intervene if UN forces crossed the parallel line, but the United States never responded to his warning. The intervention in Taiwan had already heightened tensions with China. Harry Truman authorized General Douglas MacArthur to cross the line. UN troops crossed the line, approaching the Chinese border. Mao Zedong sent more than 200,000 Chinese troops across the Yalu River into the North Korea to engage UN forces. Meanwhile, the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, allowed the Soviet Air Force to provide support and sent additional aid to China. The conflict resulted in heavy losses for United States and UN forces. They could not hold against them and retreat to the south near the parallel line. But this heavy loss prompted General MacArthur to consider using nuclear weapons. Truman turned down his request. He wisely did not want another world war. This might lead to a major war with China, especially when the Soviet Union and China had signed a defensive alliance, committing each to go to war if the other party was attacked. General MacArthur believed the use of a nuclear weapon should be his decision, not the president. Truman relieved MacArthur from command. Truman said, "I fired him because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president. I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of a..." Although he was, but that's not against the law for generals. If it was, half to 3/4 of them would be in jail. In the January 1952, after 6 months into the war, the UN filed a ceasefire negotiation, but refused by the Communist Party. And they were kept crossing the south and captured Seoul City once again. 2 months after, the UN sends more troops to the Korea, pushing back the north near the line. For the rest of the war, the US and UN against North, along with Chinese troops, fought, but there was not a massive exchange in the territory. It's 1952. The US president candidate, Dwight Eisenhower, went to Korea to learn what might end the war, and he uses this as his primary campaign goals. Eventually, Eisenhower elected as a new president. In the 1953, the Soviet leader Stalin died, and the new leader, Nikita Khrushchev, had no desire to continue supporting China's efforts and called for an end to this war. China could not continue without Soviet aid, so they decided to end this war. The North Korea, with China and UN command, signed the armistice agreement on the 27th of July 1953. Syngman Rhee refused to sign. The war ended at this point. Even though there was no peace treaty, North Korea nevertheless claims it won the war. The territory which they agreed mostly follows the 38 parallel line before the war began. About 3 to 5 million people died in this war. Most of them were civilians, making it perhaps the deadliest conflict of the Cold War era. South Korea become Western-aligned and democratic country, while the North become one-party state run by the Kim family. North Korea's first leader promoted his personal philosophy and ideology that passes from generation to the generation. And it's the most isolated dictatorship country around the world, and it considers the country to have the worst human rights record in the world. All the music, art, and sculpture glorified their great leader.